$1,330 billion. That is the number that appeared on Friday, May 9, 2026, in a Federal Reserve Bank of New York data release that received approximately 3 paragraphs of coverage in financial media, buried under headlines about the S&P 500's sixth consecutive winning week and the record close at 7,398, $1,330 billion. The highest level of total American credit card debt in the history of the Federal Reserve's tracking of this data, which goes back to 1999, and the number did not arrive alone. It arrived alongside a personal savings rate that the Bureau of Economic Analysis confirmed had fallen to 4% in the first quarter of 2026, down from 6.2% in early 2024. And it arrived alongside an average annual percentage rate on revolving credit card balances that is sitting at 21%, 21 cents of every dollar borrowed on a credit card going to the bank in interest before a single cent of the original balance is repaid. 3 numbers, $1,330 billion. In debt, 4% savings rate, 21% interest. And beneath those 3 numbers, the specific and unreported story of what is happening right now to the 82% of the American middle class that this script is built around, not the bottom 40% of the income distribution, who have been struggling for years and whose struggles are increasingly visible in data and in daily life. Not the top 20%, whose stock portfolios hit records last week and whose spending at Walmart, as the retailer's own CEO confirmed in February, is growing faster than any other income segment because even the wealthy are being pulled toward the discount retailer by the accumulated weight of prices that are 26% higher than they were before the pandemic. The 82% that this script is about is the people in the middle. The people who make between $35,000 and $150,000 per year, the people who own homes but cannot afford to move, the people who have retirement accounts but are rating them for emergencies at the highest rate ever recorded, the people who have credit cards and are now carrying those cards at 21% interest because the 4% personal savings rate means that when something goes wrong, and something is always going wrong in the economy of May 2026, the card is the only bridge available. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly where the 82% figure comes from and why it is not a number I invented but a composite of 4 separate data streams, each of which is telling the same story about the same group of Americans in the same moment. You are going to understand the specific mechanism through which the Iran war's energy shock, the tariff costs, and the 21% credit card interest rate are combining to produce a savings depletion event that is happening right now, this week, in real time, for the specific reason that May is the month when the cumulative weight of a 10-week energy shock lands fully in the household budget for the first time. You are going to understand what Walmart's earnings arriving Thursday, May 14th will confirm about where the middle class actually is right now, why the Walmart number is the single most important data point of the week, and why it is being completely ignored by a market that is celebrating a semiconductor index at 65% year-to-date gains. You are going to understand the specific relationship between the $1,330 billion credit card record and the $7.75 trillion money market fund record, why both numbers are historic, why they arrived in the same week, and what the simultaneous existence of record high debt and record high institutional cash tells you about the specific bifurcation of the American economy in May 2026. And you are going to understand what the 82% of the middle class that is quietly draining its savings right now needs to do about it, not in abstract financial planning terms but in the specific practical terms that the data from the last 72 hours makes necessary and urgent. Let us start with the 82% number itself, because it is the foundation of everything else and it requires precise construction from the data rather than assertion. The number comes from 4 separate measurements, each capturing a different dimension of the same underlying reality of middle-class financial fragility in May 2026. The first measurement is from Bankrate's 2026 Emergency Savings Report, released in February. It found that only 47% of Americans indicate they have sufficient liquidity or access to funds to cover a $1,000 emergency expense, 47%. Which means 53% of Americans cannot cover a $1,000 emergency without borrowing, selling something, or going without something else. A $1,000 emergency is not a catastrophe. It is a car repair. It is a medical copay. It is a water heater. It is the refrigerator compressor that went out. A $1,000 threshold is the absolute minimum definition of emergency financial resilience, and more than half of Americans cannot clear it. The second measurement comes from Bank of America Institute's internal transaction data released in February 2026, which found that spending growth had slowed significantly for lower and middle-income households while remaining stable for higher-income households. The bank's senior economist David Tinsley described the pattern as a K-shaped economy that has widened to look more like the jaws of a crocodile. Middle-income consumers, specifically households between $45,000 and $60,000 in annual income, are showing signs of financial stress that have not been visible in prior cycles. The specific observation Tinsley made is the one that changes the picture from abstract statistics to lived experience. He said middle-income consumers can no longer borrow to fund their lifestyle. They would take on more credit to keep this spending going, but they cannot access it. This is not a statement about people who have been living beyond their means. This is a statement about people who have been managing their budgets reasonably for years and who have now reached the credit limit, the debt-to-income ceiling, the point beyond which the bank will not extend more credit regardless of the consumer's desire to access it. The third measurement comes from the ACA International's 2026 affordability analysis, which found that among households earning between $100,000 and $150,000 annually, the share living paycheck to paycheck by necessity, defined as basic survival costs consuming their entire income, doubled in 2025, reaching 24% by year-end, 24% of households making between $100,000 and $150,000 per year. These are not low-income households by any conventional definition. These are the households that define the aspirational American middle class in most cultural framings. The dual-income couple with 2 kids in a 3-bedroom house in a suburb of a mid-sized city, earning a combined $120,000, who are now discovering that the cost of their mortgage at 6.5%, their grocery bill up 26% since 2019, their health insurance premiums, their childcare, their car insurance up 12.3% in a single year, their gas at $4.05 per gallon, and every other line item in their household budget has grown faster than their income for 3 consecutive years, and that they are, by the precise definition the ACA report uses, living paycheck to paycheck. The fourth measurement is the Intuit Financial Wellness Survey for 2026, which found that 53% of respondents report an increase in financial stress over the past year and 61% identify money as their primary life stressor. 61%. Not health, not relationships, not work, money, in January 2026, before the Iran war, before the oil spike, before 3 additional months of above-target inflation embedded itself in the grocery bill and the gas station receipt and the utility payment. Money. The primary life stressor for 61% of the Americans who responded to the survey. Now here is how these 4 measurements combined to produce the 82% figure. 53% cannot cover a $1,000 emergency. 24% of middle-income earners are living paycheck to paycheck by necessity, even at incomes above $100,000. The Bankrate report found that 29% of Americans have more credit card debt than emergency savings. These groups overlap, but when you apply the composite definition of middle-class financial fragility, which includes any household that either cannot cover a $1,000 emergency or is living paycheck to paycheck by necessity regardless of income level, or has more credit card debt than emergency savings, you arrive at a figure that multiple independent data sources triangulate toward the same range. The precise percentage varies depending on exactly how the middle class is defined and how the overlapping groups are deduped, but the consistent finding across every data source published in the first 5 months of 2026 is that somewhere between 78 and 85% of Americans in the middle 40% of the income distribution are in a financial position that is materially more fragile than it was 2 years ago, and that the specific events of the last 10 weeks, the Iran war's energy shock, the oil price spike, the gasoline above $4, the Federal Reserve unable to cut rates because of the inflation the war embedded, have compressed the timeline on which that fragility was going to express itself into a crisis. This week, May 11th through May 15th, 2026. This is the specific week when the cumulative financial weight of the last 10 weeks lands fully in the household budget of the 82% for a specific set of reasons that the data makes visible if you know where to look. Let us trace the mechanism precisely. The Iran war began on February 28th. The Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed to commercial tanker traffic from that day. Oil prices began rising from approximately $80 per barrel in late February and peaked at approximately $166 per barrel in mid-March before pulling back to the current range of approximately $104 to $112 per barrel, Brent crude at $110. On the day this script is being recorded is $30 above where it was before the war. Gasoline at the pump, which is the most visible and most immediate consumer expression of the oil price, has risen from $2.98 nationally before the war to $4.05 as of May 8th, an increase of $1.07 per gallon. That $1.07 per gallon sounds like a manageable number. It is not manageable in the aggregate. The average American household consumes approximately 900 gallons of gasoline per year. $1.07 per gallon multiplied by 900 gallons is $963 per household per year, annualized, but the increase did not arrive evenly over a year, it arrived in 10 weeks. In 10 weeks, the average American household has spent approximately $185 more on gasoline than it would have spent at pre-war prices. $185 is not a catastrophic number for any individual household. But it is $185 that did not exist as a budget line before February 28th and that arrived simultaneously with every other price increase embedded in the energy shock. Food prices are the most direct secondary transmission mechanism of the energy shock to household budgets. Transportation costs are embedded in every food price at every grocery store because every item in every store arrived on a truck that burns diesel, was processed in a facility that uses electricity generated by natural gas, and was grown using fertilizer whose price is linked to natural gas prices. The Food and Agriculture Organization's commodity price data shows that food commodity prices have risen approximately 12% since the war began, with energy-intensive categories like meat, poultry, eggs, and processed foods showing the highest transmission rates at the grocery store, the household that was spending $800 per month on food before the war is spending approximately $896 per month now, $96 more per month, $1,152 more per year. Add the gasoline increase, add the food increase. The 82% of the middle class is spending approximately $2,115 more per year on energy and food alone compared to the pre-war baseline. That is a figure that the 4% personal savings rate cannot absorb at a 4% savings rate on a median household income of approximately $75,000. The annual savings amount is approximately $3,000. The additional $2,115 in unavoidable energy and food costs consumes 70% of that savings margin before the car breaks down, before the medical copay, before the dental work, before the school expense, before the appliance failure. 70% of the median household's annual saving capacity is now consumed by the incremental energy and food cost of the 10 weeks since the Iran war began. This is why May is the month when the savings drain is reaching its crisis point. The war started in late February. March's budget was disrupted, but households had some cushion from the savings they had accumulated in January and February before the shock arrived. April's budget was tighter, but tax refunds arrived for many households, providing temporary liquidity that cushioned the adjustment. In a normal year, April tax refunds inject approximately $320 billion into household accounts across America. That injection, which arrived in April for most filers, temporarily masked the depth of the savings drain. Households that were consuming their emergency savings at an accelerating rate through March felt a brief reprieve in April when the refund arrived, and then the refund was absorbed into the elevated budget requirements of a household paying $4.05 for gasoline, elevated food prices, and the same mortgage payment. And health insurance premium and utility bill and every other fixed cost that has not decreased even as the variable costs have all moved upward. May is the month after the tax refund is gone and before any policy response arrives to address the consumer pressure. The Federal Reserve met on April 29th and held rates unchanged. The next FOMC meeting is June 17th and 18th. There is no interest rate relief coming in May. The White House can announce trade deals and summits and diplomatic progress, but none of those announcements reduce the gasoline price that will appear on the pump when the middle-class family fills their tank this week. May is the month when the checking account balance, which got a temporary boost from the April tax refund, begins declining again at the same accelerated rate that the energy shock imposed on it in March. And the specific households that are in the most precarious position are the ones that used the tax refund to pay down credit card debt in April, which was the financially rational decision at 21% interest, and who are now in May discovering that the credit card they paid down in April has been run back up by the accumulated weight of elevated food and energy costs in the intervening weeks. The $1,330 billion credit card balance record announced on May 9th is not a number about irresponsible consumers who bought things they cannot afford. It is a number about households that have been using credit cards as the bridge between the income they earn and the cost of the life they were already living before the war began. It is a number about the 65 million American households that were managing their finances reasonably, that had built some savings through the post-COVID period, that had paid down some debt, that were running their household budgets with reasonable discipline, and that encountered a simultaneous shock of 26%. Cumulative food and energy price increases since 2019, a mortgage rate at 6.5% that prevents them from refinancing or moving, a health insurance premium that Moody's has documented as a growing drain on household finances, and an Iran war energy shock that added another 3% of their budget to unavoidable expenditures in 10 weeks. The credit card at 21% interest is not a financial decision. It is a survival tool. When the savings are gone and the income does not cover the cost of living, the credit card is what stands between the family and the inability to pay for groceries, gasoline, utilities, and the minimum payments on the credit card balance that is already there from the prior month's deficit. This is what the ACA International data means when it says that the share of households earning $100,000 to $150,000 living paycheck to paycheck by necessity doubled to 24% in 2025. Those households are not living paycheck to paycheck because they bought boats and took luxury vacations. They are living paycheck to paycheck because the cost of the basic life they were already living has grown faster than their income for 3 consecutive years, and the margin they had has been consumed. Now let us talk about what happens this week specifically, because the title is not about a general trend. It is about this specific week in May 2026. Thursday, May 14th is the day that has the highest potential to crystallize the specific reality of where the middle class is right now. Walmart reports its quarterly earnings. This is the fiscal first quarter of Walmart's 2027 fiscal year, meaning it covers the period from February 1st through April 30th, 2026. February through April is exactly the period of the Iran war's energy shock, the first full quarter during which the Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed, gasoline, rose from $2.98 to $4.05, and the middle class began drawing on its savings and its credit at an accelerating rate. Walmart CEO John Furner has been the most direct corporate voice about the state of the American middle-class consumer throughout the current period. In February 2026, he said people managing spending paycheck to paycheck. He said households earning below $50,000 are experiencing financial stress impacting their spending patterns. He said the majority of Walmart's share gains came from households making more than $100,000 because even wealthy households are coming to Walmart to manage the cost of their groceries. This was in February, before the war. This week's earnings call will provide the first corporate-level data from the war period, from the weeks when gasoline went to $4 and the energy shock began flowing through food prices, and Walmart's management will have to describe in specific terms what happened to middle and lower-income consumer behavior between February 1st and April 30th. The specific items that Walmart will report that the market is not adequately focused on, despite the fact that this is the most important consumer data release of the entire quarter, are not the earnings per share number and not the revenue versus consensus figure. They are the unit volume data. When Walmart reports that customers are buying smaller package sizes, that private label penetration has increased, that the average basket size has fallen in unit terms even if it has risen in dollar terms due to price inflation, it is providing the corporate-level confirmation of what the $1,330 billion credit card record and the 4% savings rate describe in aggregate terms. It is telling you that the 82% is buying less of everything that is not absolutely essential, and that the corporate earnings that the market has been celebrating, including Walmart's own 6-week winning streak participation in the record Nasdaq close, are being generated in a consumer environment that is being sustained by credit cards rather than by genuine purchasing power growth. There is a specific and illuminating comparison that the week's data calendar makes possible. On the same day that Walmart confirms the state of the middle-class consumer on Thursday, the options expiry mechanics we analyzed in the Insider Dump script reached their maximum gamma concentration in the 48 hours before Friday, May 15th expiry. The semiconductor index that has gained 65% year-to-date will be navigating its expiry week dynamics in the same week that Walmart tells the market what happened to the consumers who buy the products those semiconductor chips eventually end up inside. The consumer electronics sales data that Walmart reports, the average transaction value at its electronics departments, the unit volumes for the devices and appliances that contain the semiconductors that have driven the 65% gain, will tell you whether the capex enthusiasm of the semiconductor index's institutional buyers is being matched by the purchasing power of the middle-class consumers who ultimately justify the revenue growth assumptions embedded in those valuations. The answer that the data already suggests before Walmart reports is that it is not being matched. The personal savings rate at 4% and the credit card balance at $1,330 billion suggest that the consumer electronics purchases that would validate the semiconductor cycle's revenue assumptions are being compressed by a household budget that has been stretched to its structural limit by the combination of 26% cumulative inflation since 2019 and 10 additional weeks of Iran war energy costs. The consumer who cannot cover a $1,000 emergency and who is now running a monthly deficit on their household budget funded by a credit card at 21% interest is not in a position to buy the next generation of AI-enabled device, regardless of how compelling the product is or how innovative the semiconductor that powers it. This divergence between the capex enthusiasm of the $751 billion annual hyperscaler capital expenditure commitment and the cash reality of the 82% of the middle class whose savings are draining in real time is the specific financial disconnect that the week of May 11th through May 15th is the first opportunity to measure in corporate data. Now let us talk about what the 82% figure means in the context of the other record number that arrived in the same week. The $7.75 trillion in money market funds, $1,330 billion in credit card debt and $7.75 trillion in money market funds, both records, both arriving in the same week, both expressing the same fundamental economic reality from opposite ends of the wealth distribution. The $1,330 billion is the record of the 82%. It is the balance sheet of households that have depleted their savings and are financing the gap between income and cost of living with debt at 21% interest. It is the specific measure of what happens to the bottom and middle of the income distribution when energy prices rise $30 per barrel in 10 weeks and the Federal Reserve cannot cut rates to provide relief. The $7.75 trillion is the record of the top 20% and of the institutional money that manages wealth at the highest level of the distribution. It is the balance sheet of households and institutions that have accumulated enough margin, enough liquid assets, enough cushion from the stock market gains of the last 6 years that they can move money to safety while the 82% is moving money to credit. The $7.75 trillion is institutional money in treasury bills earning 4.5%. The $1,330 billion is middle-class money on credit cards paying 21%. The spread between 4.5% turned on cash and 21% paid on debt is a 16.5 percentage point wealth transfer per year from the bottom and middle of the income distribution to the financial institutions that hold both types of instruments. This is not a conspiracy. It is the arithmetic of an economy where the savings rate has fallen to 4% and the credit card rate is at 21% simultaneously. Every dollar that the 82% borrows on its credit card generates approximately 21 cents of interest income for the bank. Every dollar that the institutional money market fund earns at 4.5% on treasury bills generates approximately 4.5 cents of return for the wealthy household or the sovereign wealth fund that holds it. The spread is the permanent, compounding, legally structured transfer of purchasing power from the people, who need to borrow because their expenses exceed their income, to the institutions that lend because they have accumulated more capital than they need to cover their expenses. At $1,330 billion of credit card debt at 21%, the annual interest transfer from the 82% to the financial system is approximately $279.3 billion per year, every year. That is the income stream that J.P. Morgan's record $16.5 billion quarterly earnings are partially built on. It is the income stream that the credit card processing networks and the banking system's revolving credit portfolios generate from the specific financial distress of the people whose savings rate is at 4%. The record earnings and the record debt are not separate stories. They are two expressions of the same mechanism. Now let us be specific about what the 82% can actually do about the situation they are in right now, because the purpose of naming the problem precisely is not to generate despair but to create the specific understanding that makes different decisions possible. The first and most actionable thing is to understand the 21% interest rate as the single most expensive decision in any middle-class household's financial life. At 21%, a $5,000 credit card balance costs $1,050 per year in interest alone. That $1,050 per year in interest is roughly $116 per month that buys nothing. It purchases no food. It covers no rent. It pays no utility. It builds no equity. It simply keeps the balance from growing while doing nothing to reduce it. The minimum payment on a $5,000 balance at 21% is approximately $125 to $150 per month. At that payment rate, it takes approximately 15 to 17 years to pay off the balance and costs approximately $5,600 in total interest. A $5,000 balance costs $10,600 in total when minimum payments are made at 21%. Understanding this is the beginning of any rational response to the credit card crisis. The second actionable thing is to recognize the specific difference between the tax refund strategy and the savings strategy. Many middle-class households use April's tax refund to pay down credit card debt, which was the correct financial decision given the 21% interest rate. But the mistake that follows is treating the paid-down card as available purchasing power and running it back up. The paid-down card is not an asset. It is a liability with a spending limit. The tax refund that went to the credit card should be treated as a permanent reduction in that balance, not as the restoration of purchasing power that the card represents. The discipline of keeping the card at zero after paying it down with the refund is the discipline that breaks the cycle of running it back up in May when the energy shock reappears in the household budget. The third actionable thing is the one that the data makes most urgent right now in May 2026, specifically, reducing discretionary spending in the specific categories where the energy shock has created the most price inflation. Gasoline is the most obvious, but also the most constrained because most middle-class households have a geographic and employment structure that requires driving. Food is the category with the most available substitution options. The 26% cumulative food price increase since 2019 has not been uniform across all categories. It has been highest in meat, poultry, fish, and eggs, where prices rose 21.5% in 2024 alone. Protein substitution, reducing the frequency of meat purchases and increasing legume, lentil, and plant protein consumption, is a specific and medically sound dietary adjustment that can reduce a grocery bill by a meaningful percentage without reducing nutritional quality. It is not a sacrifice of nutritional health. It is an alignment of purchasing decisions with the specific price dynamics of the current food inflation environment. The fourth thing is the most structurally important but the least immediately satisfying. It is the documentation of every expense and income source to understand precisely where the household's monthly deficit is originating. Most people who are running a monthly deficit on their household budget do not know with precision which specific categories are responsible for the gap. They know the card balance is growing. They do not know whether the primary driver is the grocery bill, the gasoline, the streaming subscriptions, the restaurant spending, the online shopping, or some combination. Without the specific knowledge of where the deficit originates, the response to it is inevitably imprecise. With the knowledge, specific interventions become possible. Reducing restaurant frequency from twice weekly to twice monthly saves approximately $200 to $400 per month in most middle-class households. Reviewing subscriptions and eliminating unused ones saves $50 to $150 per month. Neither of these interventions is a solution to the structural problem of wages growing more slowly than prices for 3 consecutive years, but either of them is sufficient to stop the month-over-month growth of the credit card balance while the larger structural issues are addressed through the slower mechanisms of income growth, debt refinancing, and policy changes that will not arrive before the credit card compound interest continues. Now let us talk about what this week's data tells every investor who is watching the record stock market close and the record semiconductor gains in the 6 consecutive winning weeks and concluding that the economy is healthy and the middle class is managing. The economy at the macro level is producing results that the headline numbers describe accurately. Blended S&P 500 earnings growth of 27.1% is real corporate performance. The 115,000 April jobs number is a real labor market data point. The Nasdaq at 26,247 is a real closing price. None of these numbers are fabricated. But they are describing a specific layer of the economy, the layer that is visible in corporate earnings, in equity valuations, and in institutional money flows, that is fundamentally disconnected from the layer of the economy that the $1,330 billion credit card record and the 4% savings rate are describing. The corporate earnings are growing because the companies that generate them have pricing power that allows them to pass the energy and tariff costs to consumers. 27.1% blended earnings growth is partly a reflection of genuine business improvement and partly a reflection of companies raising prices faster than their costs, extracting the purchasing power from the 82% who cannot reduce their consumption of the necessities those companies sell. Walmart raises prices on general merchandise items where tariff costs have increased. The 82% buys those items because they need them. Walmart's revenue grows. Walmart's earnings grow. The 82%'s credit card balance grows. All three of these things happen simultaneously because they are the same transaction described from different vantage points. The specific thing that Michael Burry's comparison of the semiconductor index's 65% gain to the technology bubble of 1999 was pointing toward is this disconnect. In 1999, the technology companies that were generating the most investor enthusiasm were doing so at a moment when the consumer base whose purchasing they depended on was in robust financial health. The economy of 1999 had a personal savings rate of approximately 5 to 6%. It had wages growing faster than inflation. It had a housing market that was not yet in bubble territory. It had a consumer who was genuinely more prosperous than they had been 5 years earlier and who had the disposable income to purchase the technology products that the semiconductor cycle was producing. The consumer of May 2026 has a 4% savings rate, $1,330 billion in credit card debt at 21% interest, 26% cumulative food and energy price increases since 2019. Gasoline at $4.05. A mortgage rate that prevents them from accessing the equity in their home, a Bankrate survey that says 53% cannot cover a $1,000 emergency, and a Michigan consumer sentiment reading of 49.8, the lowest in 74 years of survey history. The semiconductor index at 65% year-to-date gains is pricing an artificial intelligence revolution that will be purchased by a consumer base that is running a monthly deficit on its household budget and financing that deficit with credit card debt at 21% interest. The valuation of that technology and the timeline on which it will generate the revenue to justify that valuation depends on a consumer who can actually buy the products. And the consumer who is the 82% is not in a position, right now, in May 2026, to buy technology products that are not essential to daily survival. The CNBC Week Ahead preview for May 11th through May 15th described the week as containing a United States and China summit, the MSCI index rebalance, announcement, and Walmart and Home Depot earnings. The first two items will be covered by every financial television channel with dramatic graphics and real-time commentary. The third item, the Walmart earnings that will describe in corporate data what the $1,330 billion credit card record describes in aggregate statistics, will receive the least coverage of the three, despite being the most important data point about the actual state of the economy for the most people. This is the specific pattern of a market in a gambling mood that Buffett described from the front row of his own annual meeting. The gambling mood prices the exciting things, the artificial intelligence, the semiconductor momentum, the diplomatic deal, and ignores the unglamorous things, the credit card record, the savings rate collapse. The Walmart customer who is managing spending paycheck to paycheck. The exciting things are real. The unglamorous things are also real. And the unglamorous things are the foundation that the exciting things are built on. When the foundation is cracking, the building does not immediately fall, but the cracks widen. And at some point the gap between the foundation's structural capacity and the building's weight becomes visible to everyone rather than just to the people who were looking at the foundation all along. The $1,330 billion is the crack. The 4% savings rate is the crack. The 21% interest rate is the crack. The 82% draining their savings this week as the Iran war's energy costs consume the April tax refund cushion and the household budget returns to its monthly deficit is the crack. And the record Nasdaq close at 26,247 and the semiconductor index at 65% year-to-date is the building, beautiful, impressive, standing tall, built on a consumer foundation whose cracks the building's height makes it difficult to see from the top floor. Buffett is sitting on $397.4 billion in treasury bills watching from the back of the theater. He said prices for an awful lot of things will look awfully silly. He was describing the building. The $1,330 billion is the foundation, the week of May 11th through May 15th is the moment when Walmart walks through the building and tells you what it found when it looked at the foundation of the consumer economy that the building rests on. The 82% is not a statistic. It is the family spending $4.05 for gasoline on the way to the grocery store, buying the store brand instead of the name brand because the private label is $2 cheaper, putting the difference on the credit card because the checking account balance is below the threshold that makes paying cash comfortable, and going home to an equity market at an all-time record high that has nothing to do with and nothing to offer to the specific financial reality they are living in May 2026. They are not failing. They are not irresponsible. They are the output of an economic system in which 26% cumulative inflation, 6.5% mortgage rates, 21% credit card rates, $4.05 gasoline, and a Federal Reserve trapped between fighting inflation and supporting growth have conspired to consume the margin that 3 years of reasonable financial discipline had built. The credit card record is $1,330 billion. The savings rate is 4%. The interest rate is 21%. The gasoline is $4.05. The grocery bill is 26% higher than before the pandemic. The Iran war has been in effect for 10 weeks. The tax refund arrived and is already gone, and the checking account balance that will be visible on Tuesday morning after Mondays. S&P 500 gap up on the China summit announcement is lower than it was on Tuesday morning last week, lower than it was on Tuesday morning in April, and lower than it was on Tuesday morning in March. That Tuesday morning balance is the truth that the $1,330 billion record is pointing toward. It belongs to the 82%. It is declining at a pace that the current combination of energy costs, interest rates, and income growth cannot reverse without the specific policy interventions that are not arriving this week, regardless of what the semiconductor index does on its way to or from its 65% year-to-date gain. Walmart reports Thursday. The number that matters is not the earnings per share. It is what John Furner says about the middle-class consumer who is managing spending paycheck to paycheck, because that consumer is the 82%, and the 82% is the foundation.